de-silencing anti-racism. So Eve Hack talks about a multicultural policy within bilingual framework. Okay. And this was prompted by Quebecois nationalist movement, as well as increased non-European immigrants in 1960s, and this has also created this national ethos of being tolerant, accepting, and not racist, right? But then when we look at the reality of the lives and experiences of settlers of color and indigenous people, there's persistent racism, right? And also, the fact that there are very few immersion programs other than French and English. In Ontario, Jeff talked about the situation of Ontario yesterday, but in Vancouver, I was just so surprised that there was no immersion program other than French immersion when I moved to Vancouver in 2009. Finally, we have the Chinese immersion program in Vancouver, but when I looked at the website, it says that only English speakers can apply to this immersion program. So, so this limited opportunity for people of color to learn their native language. This is also, I argue, related to issues of race and issues of assimilation. So we need to think about critical anti-racism. So the critical anti-racism, I argue, consists of decolonizing, de-essentializing, de-simplifying, and de-silencing anti-racism, meaning that we need to talk about it. We need to open up our discussion and talk about racism, talk about racialization, start to collect data, and recognize the racialization and the racism in our society at different levels. So this critical anti-racism can be enabled by critically reflect on our own privilege. I have privilege as economically privileged professor in institution of higher education. Even though I am viewed as a person of color, and oftentimes I suffer from racism, but I also have privilege economically and socially. And also, we need to critically examine power relations of race, class, and gender, which exist not only between white settlers and settlers of color, but also between settlers of color and Aboriginal people, and among different groups of settlers of color. And we need to critically reflect on unequal relations of power in our own teaching and research. So I talk about these things explicitly in our class, teacher education class, right? And last term, there were maybe 5 or 6 white students, mostly practicing teachers, out of 30. So white students were a minority. And at the end of the course, I assigned an essay to them. And I think all white students wrote about having become really aware of these racialization and racism issues. And then I thought, well, it's great that I raise their awareness. But at the same time, I am privileged and I have this power as a professor, right? So they just, pleasing me by saying that I became aware of this. I'm not sure. And I don't know how I can find out. But I think we need to be really, self-reflective about these issues. So finally, I'd like to end with my narrative. The story continues. Several days later, after the conference, I gave a ride after dinner to 2 US scholars who came to give their talks for a small local symposium held at my university. They were very impressed with the beautiful nature and general ambience of Vancouver. "You must like living here, don't you?" they asked. "Yeah, but it's a racist place." My response surprised them as well as myself. It was a surprise to them because the statement was perhaps beyond their imagination. It was to me because it made me aware how disturbed I felt about the bitter experience I had several days earlier. I urge that we, as critical anti-racist scholars and educators in language education, discuss how racist and classed systems have historically and continuously created the relations of domination and subordination by decolonizing, de-essentializing, desimplifying the racist system, and striving to have a more open and critical discussion about race and role race in this racist place. So that concludes my talk, and here are some selected references. And if you have any questions or comments, please contact me. Thank you.